Let's talk about transactional down payment funding. This is sometimes called the transactional funding on a Morby method or a stack method or seller carryback down payment funding. There's a lot of names for it, so I'm sticking with something that's maybe most technical. This is a transactional funding type, and we're really funding down payment only. Let's get into why you care. We're working on 4 or 5 deals right now that are helping borrowers buy property with zero money in. Right, today, we're going to have a really short agenda. We're going to talk about what transactional down payment funding is. We'll talk about why you would ever care. Why would you ever borrow this? Why would you ever use it? And then if you did, what is the process? Is this complex? Is this cumbersome? Or is this really simple? I'll let you guess at what the answer is to that. All right, so before we talk about transactional down payment funding, let's set the stage with what is traditional funding on a real estate transaction. So let's talk about first on the left-hand side, a full cash example. Now, in all these examples, I'm going to use a $400,000 purchase price because the math is really easy to do. So let's show how this would play out. Full cash purchase, the buyer is literally bringing $400,000 cash to the seller. The seller transfers title. Incredibly simple. We're not going to spend much time on this. Green is cash moving. Purple is title transferring. And as you'll learn in the next and the following examples, red lines will show, will represent debt. And so if we talk about a typical purchase, the most common one out there in the marketplace, where somebody goes to a bank and they use a bank for most of their funding, let's say that in this case, the buyer is putting 25% down. So the buyer puts $100,000 down. Well, then a lender comes in and puts together $300,000 down. Well, if they're putting that money down, then the buyer has a debt for $300,000 to the lender. This is what we do all the time. A bank comes in, puts the money down. We have a mortgage or a bank note with them, and then we're funding the down payment amount. In this case, the down payment's $100,000. And title transfers. Now with seller carry, instead of the lending company coming in, the seller is essentially seller financing that portion of the deal. We're going to use the exact same metrics as the last one just to keep it simple. So the buyer puts in $100,000. They've arranged with the seller for the seller to finance the other $300,000. No bank in this, no lender in this. The lender is actually the seller, which means the buyer now has a debt. That's why we're using a red line for $300,000 to the seller. Now, maybe this is a balloon in 5 years. Maybe they're carrying this for 30. It doesn't really matter. That's what it is in the end. And then the seller transfers title. We have the transaction completing. Now, to get closer to what transactional down payment funding is, let's talk about when the seller will carry a portion and there's a need for a lending company. But in this case, we're going to flip it. This is the case when a seller says, hey, I need a really big down payment. That scenario, not when the seller says, oh yeah, I'll seller finance almost all of it for you. And these are the types of deals that oftentimes fall through or get thrown away because the seller is requesting such a large down payment. Let's see how that plays out and why we care. All right, so the first step, this lender in this case, we're doing a scenario where the buyer is buying the property as a long-term rental. So the lender here is maybe a DSCR lender. DSCR lender says, I'll put 75% in, and they say, all right, we'll put the $300,000 in. Well, remember, the principle here is that the buyer is not spending any money. We talked about that at the very beginning. This transactional down payment funding is a way for a borrower or a buyer to pick up a property without spending their own cash. So the lender puts in 300. Where's the other 100 coming from? Oh, sorry about that. All right, the borrower owes that lender 300, obviously. But here's where the other 100 comes from. The other 100 comes from a transactional down payment funder. So the DSCR lender puts in 300. This transactional funder puts in 100. The seller has all 400. And now this transaction can complete. The seller can transfer title. If you feel like something's out of balance here, you're probably right, because a transactional funder just put money in, has nothing back. A buyer just bought a property with only a $300,000 note, even though the seller collected $400,000. Something's definitely off. And what happens here is that seller carryback note for $100,000. Remember, they were wanting a really large down payment, but they were willing to seller carry 25% in this example. So that seller carry note comes in, and then that's what essentially funds out the transactional down payment funder. That was a lot going on all at once, mingling two different transactions essentially. And if this is how you feel, then you feel like about all of us when we first hear about this or we're going through it. Let's talk about this in a couple different steps. First, we're going to record the close. So the lender, this DSCR lender, is putting in $300,000. That creates that note. The buyer now owes them. The transactional funder puts in $100,000. Now the seller has all $400,000, and we can record the closing and the transfer title. Now we're going to finish the transaction as soon as that's complete. And the completion of the transaction is that the seller issues the seller carryback note in second position. The DSCR lender had first position, there in second position. And that note then pays off the transactional funder. All right, let's look at it in another way. One of the most common questions I get is, where does the money come from in the end that pays the transactional down payment funder? And so we're going to look at it at just a different angle. Maybe you don't need this. Maybe that all made a lot of sense to you already, but sometimes this is a different angle that helps. So the lender, remember this DSCR lender, they put $300,000 into an escrow account. The transactional down payment funder put $100,000 into an escrow account. So now this escrow account has 400 grand in it, right? When the escrow, when title then records and closes this transaction, they send $300,000 to the seller. They're not sending all 400,000, because remember, the deal that the buyer and the seller had was that the seller would carry back 100,000. That meant the seller's only going to receive 300 in cash. The other 100 is in a note, a seller carryback note with the buyer. And when that seller carryback note is recorded in second position, so let me emphasize, after sending the 300, escrow still has 100. Well, when that seller carryback note is recorded, now escrow sends $100,000 to the transactional funder. That's where that money comes from. And escrow is now at zero. So the lenders put 300,000 in. The seller has essentially put $100,000 in as a seller carryback note. The house was purchased at 400. The borrower owes the lender 300, the seller 100, and the transactional funder is cleared out. So the end result of this, the seller receives the 400 they wanted to sell their property for. 300 of it was in cash, and the other 100 is in a note that the buyer owes them, whatever those terms are. The buyer got exactly what they wanted, right? The buyer, they wanted to buy a rental property with no money. Well, that's exactly what they did. They've put no money out, and they owe 300 to a DSCR lender and 100 to the seller in the seller carryback note. So they're zero out of pocket, have the house and have a couple notes. The lender's into it 300, and the transactional funder got what they wanted. They helped make a deal happen, and they got their small fee. Everybody's happy. Win, 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 win all the way across the board. So transactional down payment funding, this is another form of short-term, high-speed private money. It's another way that you cover full costs of a transaction. It's a way that you can lock up more deals because you're not putting your cash into them. You're not losing your capital. But if you don't spend any capital, then you essentially can do an infinite amount of deals, right? You're not limited by your capital. So let's talk about why I would use this technique. Why would anybody use this technique? And I'm going to categorize this into the types of individuals or the types of real estate investors that might have some interest. Now, the main reason is there's no cash out of pocket, right? That's the reason. That's the reason that we do this. But a wholesaler maybe does this so they can start building up a portfolio of homes. A lot of the wholesalers I talk to say that what they really would like to do is build a portfolio of rental properties while they're wholesaling and making money, while they're being successful as a wholesaler. So I ask them, hey, do you ever have those deals where the seller says, oh, sure, I'll do a seller carryback, I'll seller finance this for you, but I want a huge down payment. I want 50% down or some crazy amount. You hear that and you say, well, that's not a deal then. That's exactly why you'd use this. If they're carrying half, this is a win. No money in, you have a rental. So wholesalers is a real opportunity for wholesalers that are seeing these deals all the time to start building that portfolio that many of them really want to build in while they're wholesaling. Flippers use this. I know a number of flippers that use this. It's a little bit more of a simple model for a flipper, really, at the end of the day, but they're essentially using a partial carryback, and that helps them avoid borrowing subordinate or second position or gap or whatever you want to call it, funding to complete their transactions. They can use a single hard money lender, use the carryback instead of gap lending, which saves them a ton in fees since that's incredibly expensive money to borrow. And then they can get their flip done and get out. End buyers, these are end buyers that are looking to buy things typically when you're looking to rent, right? So a lot of people are looking at buying co-living properties or sober living properties, and they are looking to do this over and over and over again. Well, unless they have infinite capital, then there's going to be some kind of capital constraint. This is a way that they can build that portfolio without the capital constraint. The trick in all of this, the two key things in this entire thing are that you can negotiate a partial seller carryback, right? 30, 40%, more than that's great, so that the DSCR lender can fill that down payment gap. If you're only getting a 5% carryback, you're probably out of luck. You're not going to find a DSCR lender that's going to give you a 95%. But if you're willing to put in the other 15% in cash, well, then you can make the whole thing happen. All right, so how do you get this money? How does this happen? We'll fund this for you. We'll fund this for you all day long. These are fantastic loans. We really enjoy doing this. We love these transactions. They're really fun. And so you come onto our website, you fill out a simple form, you give us the information about this deal that you're doing, about the seller carryback, what you've been able to negotiate. We review that, make sure that it works. Then we're communicating with the lender. This is a really important part that people ask me about. And the other day when I was talking about this, somebody brought up the fact that they've heard about this type of transaction, this type of funding, and they also heard that it was a little bit scammy, that it wasn't really a good way of doing things because you're hiding things. And that's one of the fundamental principles that us and a number of other lenders stick to, is that we're incredibly transparent with the lender. The lender knows that the seller carryback will be in a second position. The lender knows that we're a third-party funder. We're working with them, making sure that we understand what their sourcing requirements are. Where does the money have to flow through so that that lender is happy, right? All those things are transparent and out in the open with the lender. All right, so then we're informing title. We essentially send an invoice, so they send us back the money. Trivial little details like that, and money's wired, transactions happen, and all's well. So transactional down payment funding just lets you secure more deals. It doesn't absorb all your capital. All right. So thank you very much. We've talked a little bit about earnest money. We've talked about down payment, transactional down payment money. We've talked about double closes. Love to hear your questions. Give us your comments below. Talk to us about the deals that you've done like this. Let us know if you have a deal you'd love to do this way. We'd be happy to connect with you. Thank you.